The morning sun poured golden rays through the lace curtains of the old Victorian house. Birds sang sweetly, and the air was fragrant with the scent of fresh roses. I could hear my bridesmaids giggling and the soft strumming of a guitar in the distance. Today was the day I had dreamt of since I was a little girl, the day I would become Sarah Jameson. Slipping into my pristine white gown, I felt a surge of excitement and nervousness. Clara, my best friend since childhood and chief bridesmaid, stepped in to help me with the delicate buttons running down the back of my dress. "You look stunning, Sarah," she whispered, her eyes misting over with tears. "Tom is a lucky man." I smiled, taking a deep breath to calm my racing heart. "Thank you, Clara. I wish his mother would see me in the same light." Clara sighed, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. "Don't let her ruin your day. This is about you and Tom." As I took a final glance in the mirror, I looked past my reflection to see Mrs. Jameson in the hallway, talking animatedly to Aunt Marge. Even from this distance, I could hear snippets of their conversation. "Can't believe he's marrying her. If only he'd chosen someone more suited to our status." Shaking off the negativity, I walked down the grand staircase, holding onto my father's arm. He looked down at me, pride evident in his eyes. "Are you ready, darling?" Swallowing hard, I nodded. "I am, Dad." Walking down the aisle, amidst a sea of familiar faces, my eyes met Tom's. He looked dashing in his tuxedo, his face beaming with happiness. But as I moved closer, my attention was drawn to his mother. Mrs. Jameson sat with her lips pursed, her eyes darting around the room as if she were attending a funeral rather than a wedding. Upon reaching the altar, Tom leaned in, whispering, "Ignore her, Sarah." As the ceremony progressed, Mrs. Jameson's displeasure became increasingly evident. She'd sigh loudly at the romantic verses, roll her eyes at our vows, and snicker to relatives every time my family was mentioned. After the ceremony, as guests gathered around us, offering their congratulations, Mrs. Jameson approached, her cold eyes assessing me. "Sarah," she began, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "What a quaint little ceremony. I do hope you can adjust to our family standards." Biting back a retort, I simply smiled and thanked her. Tom, sensing the tension, quickly intervened. "Mother, why don't you get some refreshments?" She left, but not before shooting me one last scathing look. As the celebrations continued, I tried to focus on the love and joy surrounding us, but the shadow of Mrs. Jameson's disapproval loomed large, threatening to mar the happiness of our special day. The sound of our car tires crunching against the gravel was the first thing I noticed as Tom and I approached the Jameson estate. The grandeur of the ancestral home was evident in its towering spires, stained glass windows, and the sprawling gardens. It was a house filled with history, and now it was going to be my new home. Our first week was idyllic. Waking up beside Tom, sipping coffee on the balcony as we overlooked the manicured gardens, and exploring the nooks and crannies of the vast estate were moments of pure joy. We were like two children excitedly planning our future together. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Tom, with a hint of nostalgia in his voice, remarked, "This room has so many memories. Sarah, Christmases, birthdays." His voice trailed off as he stared into the flames. "It's beautiful," I whispered, placing my hand on his. "We'll create our own memories here." It was a week later that Mrs. Jameson began her unannounced visits. The first time, she arrived with a basket of fresh scones, her demeanor ostensibly pleasant. "Just thought I'd check in on you two. Make sure everything's in order," she said, her gaze scanning the room critically. As days turned into weeks, her visits became more frequent and less cordial. She would often comment on our choice of decor or the meals we prepared. In my time, we had a certain way of doing things, she would often say, a hint of rebuke in her voice. One particularly trying afternoon, as I was working on my online projects in the study, she barged in, her eyes narrowing at my laptop. "Still playing on that thing. You know, in our days, we believed in real jobs. Not this. Internet nonsense." Holding back my irritation, I tried to remain composed. "It's my job, Mrs. Jameson. It's what I'm passionate about." She snorted. "Passion doesn't pay the bills, dear. How do you intend to support my son?" Before I could reply, Tom entered, sensing the tension. "Mother, Sarah's doing just fine. We're doing fine." Mrs. Jameson shot him a withering look. "It's my duty to ensure you're well taken care of." As she left the room, Tom pulled me into a comforting embrace. "I'm sorry, Sarah. She just struggles with change." I sighed, resting my head on his shoulder. "It's not just about the change, Tom. She doesn't respect me or what I do." He kissed my forehead, whispering, "Give it time." But as days turned to weeks and weeks into months, Mrs. Jameson's jabs became sharper, and the chasm between our worlds grew wider. The home that was once a haven started showing the first signs of becoming a battleground. Evenings in the Jameson estate often found Tom and me in our cozy living room, the soft glow from the fireplace casting playful shadows on the walls. It was during these tranquil moments that we would discuss our dreams, plans, and sometimes the challenges we faced. However, as time passed, the specter of Mrs. Jameson's disapproval began to intrude upon even these intimate moments. One evening, as I was engrossed in updating my online portfolio, Tom looked over, his gaze fixed on the screen's glowing numbers. "Sarah," he began hesitantly, his fingers drumming on the armrest, "how much do you actually make from your online work?" I glanced at him, caught off guard by his sudden inquiry. "Why does it matter? We're comfortable, aren't we?" Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's just, Mother keeps asking. She's worried about our future." My heart sank. I had hoped our finances would remain our private matter. "Tom, it's our life. Why does she need to know?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his eyes. "She thinks you're just playing around, not making any real money. She fears I'm shouldering all our expenses." I closed my laptop, focusing my full attention on him. "Your mother has always lived a life of luxury. She doesn't understand the digital age or the opportunities it brings. My earnings are substantial, but I don't want to flaunt them, especially not to her." Tom sighed deeply. "I just wish she'd see you for who you truly are, a talented, hard-working woman." I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "I don't need to prove anything to her. Our life, our rules." There was a long pause before Tom finally spoke, his voice soft. "I know. It's just hard, watching the two most important women in my life constantly at odds." I pulled him into a hug, whispering, "Sometimes the best kept secrets are our strengths." Over the next few weeks, I noticed Tom becoming more protective of our privacy. He'd subtly change the topic when his mother probed about our finances or my job. Yet, the weight of her unspoken questions hung heavily between us, a constant reminder of the walls that still needed to be broken down. One morning, as I was preparing breakfast, Mrs. Jameson's voice floated in from the living room. "A woman should know her place, and it's not behind a computer screen." Tom's voice responded firmer than I'd ever heard before. "Mother, this is our home, our life. Please respect it." I smiled to myself, feeling a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, with time, our secret strengths would pave the way for understanding and acceptance. The city was abuzz with excitement as word spread of the grand family dinner at L'Etoile, the most prestigious restaurant downtown. It was not just a place to dine, but an experience, a statement of one's stature. The invitation itself was a meticulously crafted golden card, bearing the Jameson family emblem. As I held it in my hand, I couldn't help but feel a blend of anticipation and anxiety. Days leading up to the event were a whirlwind of dress fittings, hair appointments, and gentle nudges from Clara about maintaining composure. "Remember, Sarah," she'd counsel, in the lion's den, "keep your head high and your voice steady." The evening of the dinner, the restaurant's opulent interiors, adorned with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and gold-leafed walls, left me in awe. We were guided to a reserved section where the Jameson family and close relatives were already gathered. Tom squeezed my hand reassuringly as we took our seats. Across the table, Mrs. Jameson sat draped in a lavish evening gown, diamonds glittering at her throat. She greeted us with a curt nod, her eyes cold and calculating. Dinner commenced with light chatter about business, politics, and recent travels. Yet, beneath the surface pleasantries, I could sense an undercurrent of tension. Mrs. Jameson's snide comments were like precisely aimed darts. "Oh, Sarah," she remarked, examining my dress. "How quaint. Is this one of your online bargains?" Suppressing a sigh, I replied, "I thought it was elegant." "Mrs. Jameson," she smirked, turning to her sister. Youngsters these days and their odd tastes. The main course arrived, and the conversation took a more personal turn. "Sarah, dear," she began, her voice dripping with folks' concern, I notice your father hasn't graced us with his presence tonight. Is he, perhaps, too ashamed to attend such a lavish gathering?" My cheeks burned with indignation, but before I could muster a reply, Tom interjected, trying to defuse the situation. "Mother, not everyone has the luxury of free time. Let's not make assumptions." She shot him a disdainful look. "I merely worry about the company we keep." Just as the tension reached its peak, a jovial voice chimed in, diverting attention. Uncle Robert, always the life of the party, regaled us with tales of his recent adventures in the Alps. Yet, even amidst the laughter and distractions, I could feel the storm brewing. With every barbed comment, every disdainful glance, the rift between Mrs. Jameson and me widened, threatening to overshadow the familial bonds that should have united us. The night, which promised to be a celebration, seemed to be leading us towards an inevitable confrontation. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew increasingly stifling. The clinking of glasses and hum of conversations blended into a symphony of unease. I tried to engage in the lighter chats around, hoping to divert my mind from the looming presence of Mrs. Jameson. Desserts were served, a parade of delicate pastries, rich cakes, and exquisite chocolates. Just as I was about to take a bite from a raspberry tart, Mrs. Jameson's voice, dripping with malice, cut through the ambient noise. "Why is it," she began, her eyes fixed on mine, "that you parade around as if you belong to our world, Sarah, playing on your computer, pretending it's a job, and dragging my son down with your delusions?" The table went quiet. All eyes were on us. Tom, looking pained, tried to intervene. "Mother, this isn't the time or place." But Mrs. Jameson continued, undeterred. "No, let's settle this now. How much do you even make, Sarah? Or are you just living off my son?" Before I could muster a response, a voice called out, cutting through the tension. "Is everything all right here?" Turning, I saw the restaurant manager approaching, tall, distinguished, with an air of quiet authority. But what struck me most were his familiar eyes, mirroring my own. It was my father. Mrs. Jameson sneered. "Ah, the absentee father finally shows up. Tell me, sir, are you here to foot the bill or just to witness your daughter's charade?" Dad, calm and composed, responded. I heard enough from the sidelines. "Mrs. Jameson, it's painful to hear a mother berate her son's wife so openly." She scoffed. "And what would you know about it?" Dad's eyes hardened. "I own this restaurant. I've worked hard, sacrificed much, and built a legacy for my daughter. She's not the beggar you paint her to be." A murmur of surprise swept the table. Mrs. Jameson's face turned a shade paler. Turning to Tom, Dad continued, his voice firm, "If you can't defend my daughter, perhaps you should reconsider your choices. Respect isn't just given, it's earned." Tom looked down, shame evident in his eyes. Without waiting for a response, Dad addressed the table. "Please enjoy the rest of your evening." He then offered his arm to me. "Sarah, shall we?" Gratefully, I took it, and together, we left the Jameson table behind. As we walked out, the weight of years of silent endurance seemed to lift. The mask of civility had been removed, and in its place stood raw, unfiltered truth. The night had indeed unmasked many, revealing not just societal facades, but the depths of familial bonds and their breaking points. The fallout from that tumultuous night at El Etoile was immediate. News of the confrontation spread like wildfire within our social circles. I was both lauded and criticized, hailed for standing up to Mrs. Jameson, and rebuked for creating a scene. The morning after the dinner, I found myself sitting in the garden of my childhood home, soaking in the warmth of the early sun. The familiarity of the surroundings, the fragrant roses, and the chirping birds were a balm to my wounded soul. Dad joined me, a steaming cup of tea in hand. "You know, Sarah," he began, his voice gentle, "life is too short for regrets and resentments. Always remember that." I sighed. "I never wanted any of this, Dad. I just wanted to be happy with Tom." He took a thoughtful sip of his tea. "And are you? Happy with him, I mean?" I hesitated, the weight of recent events heavy on my mind. "I love him, Dad, but sometimes love isn't enough, especially when respect is absent." He nodded, understanding evident in his eyes. "You deserve someone who stands by you, who values you for who you are, not just as an accessory." The following weeks were a blur of legalities and tough decisions. With Dad's unwavering support, I decided to file for divorce. It wasn't an easy choice, but it felt right. The court proceedings were swift, and the judgment was clear. Mrs. Jameson was ordered to pay $50,000 in compensation for emotional distress. Emerging from the courtroom, I felt like a weight had been lifted. I was free from the chains of judgment and prejudice. Clara, ever the pillar of support, greeted me outside, a broad smile on her face. "New beginnings, Sarah," she exclaimed, pulling me into a tight hug. I nodded, tears glistening in my eyes. Yes, new beginnings. Returning to my roots, I poured my heart and soul into my online endeavors. The digital world, once a mere hobby, became my sanctuary. With hard work and dedication, my business flourished. The earnings, contrary to Mrs. Jameson's beliefs, were substantial. But it wasn't just about the money. It was the satisfaction of building something of my own, of proving my worth to myself. One evening, as I sat on my balcony, looking out at the city skyline, Dad joined me. "You've come a long way, my girl," he remarked proudly. I smiled, gratitude filling my heart. "Thanks to you, Dad. You taught me to stand up for myself." He chuckled. "No, Sarah, you had that fire in you all along. I merely fanned the flames." Together, we sat in companionable silence, two souls looking ahead to a future filled with hope, resilience, and endless possibilities.